I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was up in the plant rooms helping Theodore with the transplanting of the odontoglossum hybrids because the air in the office had become too thick with silence to breathe. Downstairs, Nero Wolfe was in his oversized chair, behind his oversized desk, engaged in his favorite Olympic sport, being motionless. He wasn't sleeping, which would have been productive in a restorative sense, and he wasn't reading, which would have been educational. He was merely existing at a high level of expertise, eyes closed, his midsection rising and falling with the rhythmic precision of a bellows. When the doorbell rang at 11:15, I didn't rush. The house on West 35th Street has its own tempo. As long as Fritz was in the kitchen and the chain was on the door, the world could wait 30 seconds. I checked the monitor and saw a man who looked like he had been assembled from several different, equally expensive suits. He was narrow, silver-haired, and possessed the kind of frantic dignity you usually only see in bank presidents who have misplaced a decimal point. I went down, gave Wolfe a look that he ignored with practiced skill, and opened the door. "Archie Goodwin?" the man asked. He didn't wait for an answer. He stepped into the hallway, smelling of sandalwood and high-stakes anxiety. "I am Julian Vane. I need to see Mr. Wolfe immediately. It is a matter of professional survival." I took his hat, which was buttery felt, and looked him over. "Mr. Wolfe is currently occupied with a very demanding internal monologue, Mr. Vane, and while I hate to be the one to tell you, he doesn't do immediately unless the house is on fire, and even then, he'd likely wait for the second alarm to see if the draft improved." "It involves the Sterling paradox," Vane said, his voice dropping an octave. "The algorithm. It's been compromised, and if it isn't recovered by Monday's opening bell, 3 of the largest hedge funds in this city will cease to exist, along with, quite possibly, their directors." I glanced toward the office door. I knew that name. The Sterling paradox wasn't just a mathematical formula. It was the holy grail of quantitative trading. It was a secret so well guarded that most people thought it was a myth, like honest politicians or a seat on the subway during rush hour. "Wait here," I said. I entered the office. Wolfe hadn't moved a muscle, but I knew he heard me. "Mr. Julian Vane is in the hall," I announced. "He's talking about algorithms and the Sterling paradox. He looks like he's about to have a stroke, and he's wearing a tie that cost more than my first car. He says the survival of several hedge funds is at stake." Wolfe opened one eye. It was a cold, amber orb that expressed nothing but profound irritation at being forced to acknowledge the existence of the external universe. "I am not an accountant, Archie, nor am I a computer technician." He didn't ask for a technician. He asked for you. He says it's been compromised. In my experience, when people say a secret is compromised, they mean someone is about to get killed or already has been. Wolfe sighed. It was a long, shuddering sound that moved his entire 1/7 of a ton. The Sterling paradox. A mathematical tautology applied to greed. Very well. Bring him in. But if he intends to weep, tell him the rug is Persian and I value it. I showed Vane in. He didn't sit, he hovered near the red leather chair like he was afraid it might charge him rent. "Mr. Wolfe," Vane began, his hands trembling slightly. "I am the lead architect for Sterling Vane. Last night, the master key for our predictive model was removed from a secure vault. It isn't just a theft. It is a disruption of the natural order. The person who took it doesn't want money. They want chaos." Wolfe leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his center of gravity. "Mr. Vane, chaos is the natural state of the universe. Order is an arrogant dream. Why have you come to me instead of the police?" "Because," Vane said, finally sinking into the chair, "the police would have to file a report. A report becomes a public record. A public record becomes a market crash. I don't want a siren, Mr. Wolfe. I want a surgeon. I want you to find the thief before the market opens in 48 hours." Wolfe looked at him for a long beat. He hated the outside world, he hated the frantic energy of finance, and he particularly hated people who interrupted his morning. But he also had a payroll to meet, and the orchid bills from Van Dorn were starting to look like the national debt of a small country. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice clipped. "Get his statement, every name, every movement. Every soul who has laid eyes on this, paradox, I pulled out my notebook. The disruption had officially entered the brownstone, and knowing my employer, things were about to get a lot more complicated than a missing string of code. It wasn't often that the red leather chair hosted a man who looked like he was vibrating at a frequency high enough to shatter the beer glasses, but Julian Vane managed to do just that. He sat on the edge of the cushion, his silver hair catching the morning light that filtered through the office windows, looking like a man who had forgotten how to exhale. Wolfe, conversely, had settled into his own chair with the permanence of a mountain range. He had sent Fritz for a tray of beer, and the clinking of the bottles as Fritz set them down was the only sound for a full minute. Wolfe poured with a steady hand, watching the foam rise with a concentration that usually suggested he was solving a problem in thermodynamics. By the time I had my notebook ready and my pen poised, the room felt less like an office and more like a pressurized chamber. Vane didn't want the beer, he wanted a miracle, or perhaps just a scapegoat. He started talking, and the names began to fly like confetti. There was a team, of course. In the world of high finance and higher math, no one works alone, mostly because you need someone else to blame when the decimal point shifts. Vane described the inner sanctum of Sterling Vane, a place that sounded less like a business and more like a monastery for people who worshipped at the altar of the algorithm. According to Vane, only 4 people besides himself had the clearance to even look at the Sterling paradox, let alone touch the hardware that housed it. He laid them out for us like a hand of cards he didn't want to play. First was Arthur Morrell, the mathematician who had actually written the core logica man Vane described as having the social graces of a cactus and the ego of a small deity. Then there was Elena Vance, the head of security and operations, a woman who had apparently spent a decade in intelligence before deciding that protecting money was more lucrative than protecting secrets. Next came Marcus Thorne, the primary investor, and a man whose appetite for risk was, in Vane's words, a danger to the city's electrical grid. Finally, there was Julian's own nephew, David Vane, a junior partner who handled the interface and, presumably, the coffee runs, though Julian insisted the boy was a genius in his own right. Wolfe drank his beer, his eyes half closed, his expression one of profound boredom. I knew the signs, though. He was cataloguing every tremor in Vane's voice, every shift in his posture. When Vane finished his initial roll call, the office felt crowded even though it was just the 3 of us. The outsiders had arrived, not in person yet, but their shadows were already stretching across the Persian rug. The sanctity of the brownstone, usually a fortress of orchids and fine dining, was now being leaned upon by the frantic, greedy world outside. "Mr. Vane," Wolfe said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from his shoes. "You have described a circle of individuals who are all, by your own admission, remarkably clever and remarkably well compensated. You have also described a theft that required not only physical access but a sophisticated understanding of your security protocols. You are telling me that one of these 4 people has betrayed you, yet you remain here, wasting my time with adjectives when you should be providing evidence." Vane flinched as if Wolfe had thrown a heavy book at him. "That is why I am here, Mr. Wolfe. I cannot accuse them. If I am wrong, the firm implodes. If I am right and I handle it poorly, the firm implodes. I need a third party. I need a mind that isn't clouded by the $400 million currently at risk." Wolfe's eyes opened at the mention of the figure. It wasn't that he was greedy, but he had a healthy respect for the kind of fee that such a sum could generate. He looked at the clock. It was nearly time for his afternoon session in the plant rooms. He detested being late for the orchids, as they never asked for his opinion on hedge funds or spoke in trembling tones about market crashes. "Very well," Wolfe said, the words sounding like a heavy gate closing. "They will come here, all of them, tonight at 9. Archie will arrange it. He will also ensure that they understand that their presence is not a request, but a requirement for their continued liberty." Vane looked relieved, which was a mistake. Dealing with Nero Wolfe was like dealing with a landslide. You might be happy it's moving in the direction of your enemies, but you should never forget that you're standing in its path. Vane stood up, thanked Wolfe with a jerky nod, and let me show him to the door. As soon as the bolt clicked shut, I walked back into the office. $400 million, I said, leaning against the door frame. "That buys a lot of beer, even the imported stuff." Wolfe didn't answer. He was already looking toward the elevator, his mind already half submerged in the world of Catalia and Miltonia. But his jaw was set in a way that told me he was already dissecting the Sterling paradox. The outsiders were coming, and the brownstone was ready to swallow them whole. I went to the desk to start making the calls, wondering which of Vane's quartet would be the first to try and lie to me. It's a hobby of mine watching people try to outsmart a man who hasn't left his house in years but still knows exactly what they're thinking. At exactly 9 o'clock, the doorbell buzzed, announcing the arrival of $400 million worth of anxiety. I had spent the afternoon running background checks that confirmed Julian's summaries but added a little flavor. Arthur Morrill had twice been sued for intellectual property disputes. Elena Vance had a gambling marker in Atlantic City she thought was buried. Marcus Thorne was over-leveraged in a lithium mine. And David Vane had a taste for rare sports cars that outpaced his junior partner's salary. They all had reasons to want the Sterling paradox for themselves, or to sell it to the highest bidder. I opened the door and ushered them into the hallway. They entered like a delegation from a warring country sticking close together, but looking at each other as if expecting a knife in the ribs. Marcus Thorne was first, a man who took up space not through physical size, but through an aggressive, restless energy. He wore a custom suit that probably cost a month of my salary, but he wore it like it was armor he didn't trust. Next was Elena Vance, moving with the quiet precision of someone who habitually checks for exits. She was striking, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that immediately assessed the threat level of our coat rack. Arthur Morrill shuffled in third, smelling of stale coffee and superiority, clutching a battered leather briefcase like it was a life preserver. Finally, there was David Vane. He shared his uncle's silver hair, though prematurely, but lacked the older man's nervous flutter. He looked composed, almost bored, which in my experience is usually a mask for something much uglier. I guided them into the office. Wolfe was already in his chair, a fresh bottle of beer before him. The room, usually a sanctuary of measured thought, immediately felt cramped with their combined ambition and dread. Thorne didn't wait for introductions. He planted himself in the red leather chair, leaning forward. "Mr. Wolfe, Julian told us we had to be here or face the police. I find your involvement irregular, and this entire charade a waste of time. My money is on the line, and every minute we spend in this room is a minute the thief uses to find a buyer." Wolfe did not look at him. He poured his beer, watching the foam rise exactly 1/8 of an inch above the rim, then settle back. "Mr. Thorne, if your money were the only thing on the line, I would be upstairs attending to my Miltonias. But Mr. Julian Vane has hired me to locate a stolen mathematical key. Since that key was taken from a vault accessible only by the four of you, logic dictates that the thief is currently breathing the air in my office." "That is an absurd accusation," Morrill snapped, his voice a high, reedy tenor. He refused to sit hovering near the globe. "The paradox is my creation. I wrote the core logic. Why would I steal my own work? Because," Elena Vance said smoothly, taking a seat on the yellow sofa, "Sterling Vane owns the copyright. Arthur, you write the music, but they own the publishing rights. If you wanted to start your own firm, taking the key would be the only way to ensure your new algorithms went hopelessly behind." Morrill's face flushed a dull, angry red. "And what about you, Elena? Security is your domain. A blind spot in the cameras, a bypassed proximity sensor, who else could arrange that without setting off alarms?" "If I were going to steal it," Vance replied, her voice dropping to a dangerous chill, "you wouldn't know it was gone until the market had already collapsed." David Vane chuckled. It was a dry, hollow sound that drew everyone's attention. He leaned against the edge of my desk, much to my annoyance. "This is exactly what the thief wants," David said. "Us turning on each other while they quietly negotiate a sale. We need to be looking at external threats, Mr. Wolfe, not dissecting the internal team." Wolfe finally moved his eyes, letting them rest heavily on the young man. "A comforting sentiment, Mr. Vane, but external threats do not possess your security protocols. The perimeter was not breached. It was bypassed by someone who held a map. One of you possesses a secret, and unfortunately for you, secrets are the only currency I accept." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Archie, lock the front door. The tension in the room is suddenly thick enough to cut. We are going to have a long conversation about mathematics and motivation." The interrogation lasted until 2:15 in the morning, which meant Wolfe missed his scheduled bedtime by exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes. He was not gracious about it. By the time I unlocked the front door and watched the four of them file out into the cool April night, they looked like they had been run through a meat grinder and reassembled by an amateur. Wolfe hadn't accused any of them outright, which was his style. Instead, he had asked them seemingly unrelated questions about their schedules, their coffee habits, and their opinions on prime numbers, letting them tie their own knots. When I came down for breakfast at 8, Fritz was serving me pancakes, and Wolfe was already upstairs with the orchids, trying to forget that humanity existed. He had left a slip of yellow paper by my orange juice. It had 3 addresses on it and a single instruction. Look at the dust. I didn't need a translation. He wanted me to see what our suspects were hiding when they weren't sitting in our red leather chair, trying to look innocent. My first stop was Arthur Morrell's apartment down in the village. For a man who had helped invent a $400 million algorithm, he lived like a graduate student who was 2 months behind on rent. The building smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. I didn't bother knocking on his door. I had already confirmed he was at the firm's offices trying to patch the holes the missing key had left behind. I picked the lock on his front door, a pathetic 5-pin tumbler that took me exactly 11 seconds to bypass and slipped inside. The place was a disaster of loose papers, half-empty coffee cups, and whiteboards covered in math that made my eyes cross. But I was not there for math. I checked his desk drawers. Tucked under a stack of unpaid electric bills was a glossy brochure for a private research facility in Switzerland, accompanied by an application for residency. It was dated 3 weeks ago. A man doesn't plan to move to a neutral country unless he's planning to come into a lot of money, he doesn't want taxed, or he's planning to run from something. I put it back exactly as I found it. Next up was Marcus Thorne. Thorne didn't live in an apartment, he lived in a fortress on the Upper East Side. Since breaking and entering there would require a tactical team, I opted for a different approach. I found his regular driver waiting by the curb in a sleek black town car. A $50 bill and a conversation about the Yankees got me exactly what I needed. Thorne had a detour the night the algorithm went missing. Instead of going straight home from the firm, he had stopped at a diner in Queens for 20 minutes. He hadn't eaten. He had just sat in a booth with a man in a grey overcoat, exchanged an envelope, and left. I spent the afternoon tracking Elena. Since her job was security, I knew she'd be paranoid, so I didn't follow her. I followed her money. A few calls to some unsavory acquaintances in New Jersey confirmed that her Atlantic City debt wasn't just buried, it had been miraculously paid off in full 48 hours before the theft. Paid in cash, by a courier who didn't leave a name. By 5 o'clock, my feet hurt, my patience was thin, and I had enough circumstantial evidence to hang all 3 of them. Morrell was planning an escape, Thorne was making midnight payoffs, and Elena had suddenly found a pot of gold just before the firm's crown jewel went missing. The only one who seemed entirely clean was David. He had spent the evening of the theft at a high-end club, buying drinks for models and complaining about his uncle. I headed back to West 35th Street, grabbing the evening paper from a newsstand on the corner. The financial section was already buzzing with rumors of instability. The leak was starting. If Wolfe didn't wrap this up soon, the firm was going to crater before we even sent a bill. I let myself into the brownstone, hung my hat, and stopped in the kitchen to pour a cold glass of milk. Fritz gave me a sorrowful look, mourning my lack of appreciation for his upcoming dinner preparations. I gave him a wink, set the glass on the counter, and headed for the office. It was time to give the genius his dust and see what kind of mud he could make out of it. The clock on the mantel struck 6, its chime echoing through the office with a finality that usually signaled the end of the day's frustrations and the beginning of the evening's culinary worship. I had just finished giving Wolfe the rundown on the Swiss brochures, the midnight diners, and the vanishing gambling debts. He sat there, his eyes fixed on a small, gold-flecked stone he used as a paperweight, his face a mask of granite. He didn't seem impressed by my legwork, which is his standard way of saying thank you. I was halfway through a sentence about David Vane's club hopping when Fritz appeared in the doorway, his face pale and his hands tucked into his apron as if he were hiding a wound. "Mr. Wolfe," Fritz said, his voice barely a whisper. In the kitchen, someone has been moving things. Wolfe's head snapped up. An intruder in the office was an annoyance, an intruder in the kitchen was an act of war. We followed Fritz into his kingdom, the stainless steel surfaces gleaming under the overhead lights. Fritz pointed to the spice rack, a custom-built affair that held more secrets than the State Department. A small jar of white peppercorns had been moved 3 inches to the left, out of its alphabetical sequence. To anyone else, it was nothing, a breeze, a mistake. To Fritz, it was a desecration. But it wasn't the pepper that stopped Wolfe. It was the small wooden cutting board near the service elevator. Lying in the center of it was a single, dried sprig of rosemary, snapped clean in half. Next to it, resting on a clean white napkin, was a small silver thumb drive. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice dangerously quiet, "did you leave the back door unsecured?" "I checked it twice before I went to the village, and Fritz was here all afternoon," I said, my hand instinctively drifting toward the shoulder holster I wasn't wearing. "Nobody came through the front, and the basement windows are barred. Unless the thief is a ghost with a taste for herbs, we've got a problem." I took a silk handkerchief from my pocket and picked up the drive. It was cool to the touch and devoid of markings. We went back into the office, the atmosphere now so charged with tension that I expected the light bulbs to pop. Wolfe watched as I plugged the drive into my desk computer. A single file appeared on the screen titled simply, "The Remainder." I opened it. It wasn't the algorithm. It was a series of photographs, digital captures of internal memos from Sterling Vane, dated over the last 6 months. They weren't about the paradox. They were about Julian Vane. They detailed a systematic siphoning of company funds into an offshore account, hidden under the guise of research and development. The amounts were staggering, enough to make the $400 million theft look like a secondary concern. "Well," I said, leaning back as the scrolling text reflected in my vision, "it looks like our client hasn't been entirely honest about who the victim is. Julian isn't just the architect, he's the embezzler. This drive is a blackmail note, or a confession delivered by a third party." Wolfe didn't look at the screen. He was staring at the space where the air had been disturbed. The rosemary, Archie, think, it was snapped. A broken branch. A signal of mourning, or perhaps a sign of a broken contract. And the spice car. It was moved to highlight the intrusion, not to hide it. This was not a thief seeking profit. This was an inhabitant of this house making a point. An inhabitant. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Fritz was in the garden for 20 minutes cutting chives. Theodore was in the greenhouse. I was in the village. You were here. I was in the plant rooms. Wolfe muttered, his features tightening. The house was empty for a window of 18 minutes between 2 and 2:20. Someone knew the schedule. Someone knew exactly where Fritz kept the white pepper. And someone knew that a disruption in this house would be felt more keenly than a theft at the firm. He stood up, a rare and startling movement that signaled the gravity of the situation. He walked to the window and looked outside. A stranger had breached the sanctity of the brownstone, not but by someone who understood the rhythm of our lives. The Sterling paradox was no longer just a financial disaster, it was a personal insult. "Call Saul Panzer," Wolfe commanded without turning. "Tell him I need the history of Julian Vane's private life, specifically any connections to a woman named Rosemary, or perhaps a gardener, and check the basement again. I want to know how they got in without triggering the alarm." I went to the phone, my mind racing. The case had shifted. The suspects I had spent the day tracking were suddenly bit players in a much larger, much more intimate drama. Someone had entered our house, snatched an herb and left a bomb on the kitchen counter. For Nero Wolfe, hunting was no longer about the money. It was about the audacity of trespassing. Whoever had moved that spice jar had just guaranteed that Wolfe wouldn't rest until they were crushed. I dialed Saul's number, watching Wolfe's reflection in the glass. He looked like a man preparing for an execution. The silence of the brownstone was gone, replaced by the low, humming growl of a predator who had finally found the scent. Saul Panzer arrived at the kitchen door at precisely 8:15, looking as usual, like a man who had just been evicted from a very low-rent apartment and was perfectly content with the arrangement. Saul is the only man Wolfe trusts with the delicate business of being invisible, mostly because Saul can blend into a brick wall if the situation requires it. I led him into the office, where Wolfe was already back in his throne, 3 empty beer bottles standing like silent sentinels on his desk. The atmosphere was no longer just tense, it had curdled into a cold, methodical anger. Wolfe didn't greet Saul with a handshake or greeted him with a question about a bank in the Caymans. Saul sat on the edge of the yellow sofa, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't need a notebook, his brain was a steel trap for the kind of details that make or break a man's reputation. He had spent the last 4 hours digging through the digital and physical trash of Julian Vane's private life, and what he had found made the sterling paradox look like a schoolboy's math homework. Julian wasn't just siphoning money to save himself, he was siphoning it to pay for a ghost. 10 years ago, Julian had been involved in a hit-and-run in Connecticut that had left a young woman named Rosemary Thormeth, younger sister of our investor Marcus Thorne, permanently disabled. The records had been scrubbed, the police had looked the other way, and the settlements had been paid in untraceable increments ever since. "The money on that thumb drive, Mr. Wolfe," Saul said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. "It wasn't for research. It was hush money, but the payments stopped 3 months ago. Not because Julian ran out of cash, but because Rosemary Thorne died in a care facility in Zurich. The motive for the blackmail disappeared, but evidence of embezzlement remained. Someone found those Philosomioin who knew that if they surfaced, Julian Vane wouldn't just lose his firm head, spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary." I watched Wolfe's face. The mention of the name Thorne hung in the air like a poisonous gas. Marcus Thorne, the aggressive investor who had sat in our red chair and demanded action, hadn't just been protecting his money, he was the victim's brother. If he had found out that his partner was the man who had ruined his sister's life and then used the firm's funds to cover it up, the sterling paradox wasn't a theft, it was an opening move in a blood feud. And the intrusion, Saul, Wolfe asked, his eyes narrowing until they were mere slits of gold. How did our visitor bypass the security of this house? Saul reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, bent piece of copper wire and a photograph. "They didn't bypass the alarm, Mr. Wolfe. They used a master code. There are only 3 people outside of this house who have ever had the security sequence for your basement entrance. One was the technician who installed it 5 years ago. One was the inspector. And the third was the firm that provided the encrypted hardware for your office computer's sterling vein." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack the floorboards. Irony was a bitter pill, even for Wolfe. The very man who had hired us to protect his secrets had provided the keys to our own front door. But it wasn't Julian who had come here. Julian was too terrified of his own shadow to step into Wolfe's kitchen and snap a rosemary sprig. It was someone who knew the history, someone who knew the house, and someone who wanted Wolfe to see the rot at the center of the paradox. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a low, vibrating growl, "we are no longer looking for a thief. We are looking for an executioner. The theft of the algorithm was a lure to bring us into the fray, to force Julian Vane into a position where he had to hire me. The drive left in the kitchen was the killing blow. The person who took the paradox didn't want the money, they wanted Julian to watch as everything he built was dismantled by the very man he sought for protection." I stood up, feeling the weight of the case shift from a mystery to a trap. We had been used as someone's revenge tool. The broken rosemary wasn't just a sign of mourning, it was a signature. Marcus Thorne had the motive, but Elena Vance had the skills, and Arthur Morrill had the access. And then there was David Vane, the nephew who stood to inherit an Ash Kingdom if his uncle fell. "Call them," Wolfe commanded, his hand coming down hard on the desk. "All of them. Tell them the paradox has been recovered and is currently in my possession. Tell them I require their presence at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning for the final distribution of assets. And Archie tells Fritz to prepare a light lunch. We are going to have a very crowded office, and I suspect several of our guests will lose their appetites before the first course is served." I went to the phone, my mind already playing through the permutations of the gathering. Saul gave me a quick nod and faded back toward the hallway, his job done, leaving us with the pieces of a puzzle that had turned into a suicide note. As I dialed the first number, I looked back at Wolfe. He was staring at the small, broken sprig of rosemary furs had brought back from the kitchen. He wasn't thinking about the $400 million anymore. He was thinking about justice and the fact that in this house, the only person allowed to orchestrate a drama was Nero Wolfe himself. The pressure was moving, the snare was set, and by noon tomorrow, the Sterling paradox would finally be solved, though I doubted anyone would be happy with the answer. The morning air at Brownstone was brittle. Wolfe had spent the early hours in the plant rooms, not for his usual pleasure, but as a tactical retreat to sharpen his claws among the orchids. By 10:30, I had the office prepped. I checked the drawer of my desk to ensure my Colt was within reach, not because I expected a shootout, but because when you corner people who have everything to lose, they tend to forget their manners. Fritz was busy in the kitchen, but the usual aroma of roasting lamb was absent today. The house smelled of floor wax and impending judgment. Wolfe descended the elevator at exactly 11 o'clock, his face a mask of inscrutable yellow ivory. He took his seat, adjusted his blotter by a hair's breadth, and gave me a nod. The suspects arrived in a cluster, a phalanx of expensive wool and terrified eyes. Julian Vane looked like he had aged a decade overnight. Marcus Thorne was vibrating with a suppressed, jagged energy, while Elena Vance maintained her icy composure. Arthur Morrill looked physically ill, and David Vane was unusually quiet, his eyes darting between Wolfe and the heavy safe behind the desk. They took their seats, and the room immediately felt like a courtroom where the judge had already decided on the sentence. Wolfe began without preamble, his voice a low, melodic rumble that commanded the space. "We are here because the Sterling paradox has been found. A rival firm did not take it, nor was it stolen for the purpose of a simple sale. It was taken as a catalyst away to force reckoning." He paused, letting his gaze drift over Julian Vane, who was clutching the arms of the red leather chair as if he were afraid of floating away. "Mr. Vane, you hired me to find a thief. In doing so, you invited a professional observer into a house of mirrors. You assumed I would look only at the algorithm, ignoring the shadow it cast. Mr. Wolfe, please," Julian stammered, his voice thin. "The market opens in less than 20 hours. If the key is returned, we can." "The key," Wolfe interrupted, "is a string of numbers. It is insignificant compared to the debt it was meant to collect." He turned his attention to Marcus Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, your sister Rosemary was a tragic figure, a life interrupted by a cowardice that was then compounded by a decade of financial manipulation. You have spent years as a partner to a man you suspected was responsible for her ruin, waiting for the proof that would allow you to dismantle him." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thorne's knuckles turned white. "What are you talking about? My sister died of natural causes." "She died of a broken heart and a shattered spine," Wolfe snapped, his first show of real heat. "And she died while Julian Vane was using company funds to pay for the silence of those who knew the truth. But you didn't steal the algorithm, Mr. Thorne. You are too direct a man for such a convoluted gambit. You would have used a tire iron, not a thumb drive." Wolfe shifted his eyes to Elena Vance. "And you, Miss Vance, with your gambling debts and security expertise. You were the perfect candidate for a frame-up. You were provided with the funds to clear your markers precisely so that, when the theft occurred, the trail of breadcrumbs would lead directly to your door." "I don't appreciate being a character in your fiction, Wolfe," Elena said, though her voice lacked its usual steel. "It is not fiction," Wolfe said. "It is revenge choreography." The thief knew that by stealing the paradox they would force Julian to seek help. They knew Julian would come to me, and they knew that I, being diligent, would uncover the embezzlement. They even went so far as to enter this house Mihometto, ensure that the evidence was placed directly in my hands. It was a calculated risk, born of a deep, abiding hatred. Wolfe leaned forward, his bulk casting a long shadow over the desk. He was no longer just a detective, he was an engineer of human frailty. The person who took the key did not want the money. They wanted the exposure. They wanted the Sterling Vane name to be synonymous with fraud and hit-and-run homicide. They wanted to destroy the uncle to avenge the aunt. He turned his head slowly toward David Vane. The young man didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just stared back at Wolfe with a cold, terrifying vacuum of expression. "You were very clever, David. You used your uncle's security codes, your knowledge of his crimes, and even my own household schedule to stage your play. But you made one error. You assumed that because I am sedentary, I am also blind. The office was so silent that the ticking of the clock on the mantel sounded like a hammer against an anvil. David Vane did not move, he remained perched on the edge of the desk, his youthful features frozen in a mask of practiced indifference. Others in the room seemed to have stopped breathing. Julian Vane looked at his nephew with a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension, his mouth working silently like a fish out of water. Wolfe, for his part, sat perfectly still, his yellow eyes locked onto the young man who had dared to use the brownstone as a stage for his personal vendetta. "You speak of errors, Mr. Wolfe," David said at last, his voice remarkably steady, "but you haven't produced a single shred of proof. You've offered a compelling narrative. I'll give you that. It's the kind of thing that makes for excellent dinner conversation, provided one has the stomach for melodrama. But in a court of law, or even in a board meeting, your observations are nothing more than the guesses of a man who spends too much time looking at flowers." Wolfe's lips tightened into the faint line that I knew served as his version of a predatory smile. "A common misconception, David. You believe that because I do not chase suspects down dark alleys, I do not gather evidence. When you entered this house through the basement door, you were careful. You knew the alarm codes, you knew the layout. You even knew the exact moment Fritz would be in the garden. But you are a creature of the city, and you lack the fundamental respect for the physical world that a house like this demands." Wolfe gestured toward me. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small glass vial. Inside was a tiny, jagged fragment of dark blue plastic, no larger than a grain of rice. I set it on the desk between them. David's eyes flickered toward it for a fraction of a second, and in that moment the mask slipped. "This," Wolfe continued, his voice dropping into a register of absolute authority, "is a piece of the casing from a very specific, high-end electronic key fob used only by the owners of a certain Italian sports car. Archie found it wedged into the floorboards of the basement landing this morning. Apparently, as you hurried to leave, you brushed against the heavy iron bolt of the door, chipping the housing of your car key. It is a minor thing, a trifle, but it is a trifle that places you in my basement at the exact hour the security logs were bypassed." David's face paled, the color draining away until he looked like a marble bust. "That proves nothing. I've been to this house before. I could have dropped that at any time. Except," I chimed in, leaning back in my chair, "the basement was professionally scrubbed and waxed on Tuesday morning. We're very particular about our floors, David. That chip wasn't there when the waxer finished at noon. It appeared sometime between then and yesterday evening when the ghost visited the kitchen. And since you're the only one in this room who drives a car with a key fob of that specific midnight blue polymer, I'd say the tailors in the state penitentiary are going to have a very easy time fitting you for a suit." Marcus Thorne stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. He wasn't looking at Wolfe anymore, he was looking at Julian. "You killed her," Thorne whispered, his voice shaking with a rage that had been simmering for a decade. "You killed Rosemary, and then you let this boy used it as leverage. You've been bleeding the firm dry to cover your own cowardice while I sat across the table from you every day." "I didn't mean to," Julian cried out, finally breaking. He collapsed forward, his head in his hands. "It was an accident, Marcus. It was dark, I panicked, and then the payments started. I thought I was atoning. I didn't know David found the records. I didn't know he was the one." "He wasn't atoning, Mr. Thorne," Wolfe said, his eyes never leaving David. "He was surviving. And David wasn't seeking justice for his aunt. He was seeking a vacuum. He knew that by exposing his uncle's crime through my intervention, he could force Julian out and step into the leadership of Sterling Vane unchallenged. He wanted the paradox for himself, and he wanted the wreckage of his uncle's reputation to serve as his stepping stone. It was a masterpiece of cold-blooded ambition, executed with the precision of the very algorithms he supposedly admires. The room erupted into a cacophony of accusations and denials, but Wolfe simply rang his bell for Fritz. The performance was over. The logic had been laid bare, the trespasser had been identified, and the sanctity of the brownstone, though bruised, had been vindicated. David Vane sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the tiny blue fragment on the desk, realizing too late that in Nero Wolfe's world, the smallest detail is always the heaviest. I reached for the telephone to call Inspector Kramer. It was going to be a long afternoon, but at least the office air was finally starting to clear. The arrival of Inspector Kramer was, as it always is, a symphony of slamming doors and indignant chewing of a dead cigar. He stormed into the office with a tale of two plainclothesmen, his face a shade of red that suggested his blood pressure was currently competing with the stock market. He looked at the gathered assembly of high-finance wreckage, Julian Vane sobbing into his hands, Marcus Thorne being held back from physical assault by Elena Vance, and David Vane staring at the floor with the hollow gaze of a fallen statue. Kramer didn't ask what was going on. He looked at Wolfe and demanded to know why the precinct switchboard had been lit up like a Christmas tree by a hysterical hedge fund director. Wolfe, who had regained his composure the moment the truth was out, did not even look up from his beer. He merely pointed a thumb toward my desk, where I had neatly arranged the thumb drive, the blue plastic fragment, and a recorded statement ID managed to bully out of Julian before the police arrived. It was a clean package, tied with a bow of pure logic. I spent 20 minutes giving Kramer the shorthand version, the hit and run, the decade of embezzlement, the stolen algorithm used as a smokescreen, and the nephew who had tried to play both sides of the board. Kramer took it all in, his eyes darting between the evidence and the suspects, his jaw working rhythmically on his cigar. By the time the police had cleared the room, taking the Vanes both the coward and the predator into custody, the office felt strangely cavernous. Marcus Thorne had been the last to leave, stopped by the door for a moment to look back at Wolfe. There was no gratitude in his eyes, only the heavy, exhausted realization that his sister's ghost had finally been laid to rest at the cost of his own professional life. The Sterling Vane firm wouldn't survive the weekend. The scandal of the hit and run and the financial fraud would ensure that the paradox was buried forever under a mountain of litigation. Justice had been delivered, but like most things Wolfe touched, it wasn't particularly pretty. I walked back into the office after locking the front door for the final time that afternoon. The silence was back, thick and comforting. Wolfe had already signaled Fritz to remove the tray and the used glasses. He was sitting with his eyes closed, his chin resting on his chest, looking for all the world like he had spent the morning doing nothing more strenuous than breathing. I sat at my desk and began the tedious process of typing up the final report, my fingers flying over the keys as the late afternoon sun began to stretch across the rug. "You know," I said, not looking up from the typewriter, "you were taking a hell of a risk with that plastic chip. If David hadn't been the kind of kid who treats his car better than his family, he might have just laughed at us. It was a 1 in a million shot that had actually hit the bolt hard enough to leave a calling card." Wolfe didn't open his eyes. Risk, Archie, is for those who cannot see the inevitable. David Vane is a perfectionist. Perfectionists are always betrayed by what they believe they have mastered. He was so focused on the timing of our movements and the encryption of the drive that he forgot he was a physical body, occupying physical space. He moved through this house with the arrogance of a ghost, forgetting that even a ghost must leave a shadow. He left a shadow, all right. A shadow that's going to be about 6 feet wide and 20 years long, I muttered. I looked at the small, broken sprig of rosemary that was still sitting on the corner of the desk. I picked it up and tossed it into the wastebasket, and I hope you're planning on charging the estate for the cost of re-alphabetizing the spice rack. Fritz is still there, muttering about the white pepper. I think he's going to need a week off just to recover his sense of order. Wolfe opened one eye, an amber slit of mild amusement. Order has been restored, Archie. The intrusion has been purged. The Sterling paradox has been resolved into its component parts. Greed, vanity, and a very poorly executed attempt at vengeance. Now, if you are finished with your commentary, I believe it is nearly time for dinner. Fritz mentioned a gigart d'agneau with a crust of herbsnon of which, I trust, will be snapped in half. He closed his eyes again, returning to his state of immobile grace. I finished the last paragraph of the report, feeling the familiar weight of the brownstones settle back into place. The world outside might be crashing, but inside these walls, the only thing that mattered was the temperature of the lamb and the fact that the office was, once again, entirely our own. The evening shadows had finally claimed the office, leaving only the soft glow of the desk lamp to compete with the dying embers of a day that had cost Julian Vane his freedom and David Vane his future. I had finished the final report, 3 copies neatly stapled and ready for a file cabinet that was already bulging with the failures of people who thought they were smarter than the man in the oversized chair. Wolfe hadn't moved for nearly an hour, a record even for him, but I knew the wheels were still turning. He wasn't thinking about the sterling paradox or the millions of dollars that had evaporated into thin air. He was waiting for the chime of the dinner gong. When it finally sounded, a crisp, silver note that cut through the silence like a scalpel, Wolfe didn't jump. He rose with a slow, majestic deliberation, adjusting his waistcoat over his impressive middle. He didn't look like a man who had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar conspiracy. He looked like a man who had successfully navigated a minor inconvenience and was now ready for his reward. We walked into the dining room where Fritz had laid out a spread that made the morning's tensions feel like a distant, unpleasant dream. The Gigot Diagno was there, smelling of garlic and victory, surrounded by a garden of perfectly glazed vegetables. We ate in the kind of silence that is only possible between 2 people who have survived a siege. It wasn't until the salad course delicate arrangement of endive and watercress that Wolfe finally spoke. He took a sip of a vintage claret, swirled it once in the glass, and looked toward the window that faced the street. The world outside was still there, loud and frantic and full of people trying to find a shortcut to the top. But inside the brownstone, the walls were thick and the rules were absolute. Logic, Archie, is a demanding mistress, Wolfe said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to harmonize with the clink of the silverware. People like the Vanes treat it as a tool, something to be picked up when they wish to build a fortune and discarded when it becomes inconvenient to their desires. They forget that logic is not a weapon of the mind, but a condition of existence. To violate it is not merely to make a mistake, it is to invite the universe to correct you. David Vane thought he could use the truth to lie. He believed he could manipulate the sequence of cause and effect to suit his own ends, forgetting that the smallest deviation, a chip of plastic, a misplaced jar, is enough to bring the entire structure down upon the architect's head. I pushed a bit of endive around my plate, thinking about the look on David's face when he realized he'd been caught by a piece of his own car. He was a shark, Nero. He just didn't realize he was swimming in a very small pond with a much bigger fish. He thought your obsession with the way this house is run was a weakness he could exploit. He didn't realize that for you, the way a spice jar sits on a shelf is just as important as the way a man kills his partner. It's all part of the same picture. Wolfe grunted, which was his version of a standing ovation. Precisely. Integrity is not a quality one can apply selectively. A man who is careless with his surroundings will eventually be careless with his crimes. The sterling paradox failed because it was built on the assumption that human behavior can be reduced to a predictable formula. But humanity is not a formula, Archie. It is a mess of contradictions, fueled by appetites and hindered by conscience. David Vane accounted for the greed and the fear, but he failed to account for the fact that I do not like my kitchen disturbed. He signaled for the coffee, his expression softening as the aroma of the dark roast filled the room. The case was closed, the fee would eventually be collected from whatever remained of the estate, and the orchids were waiting upstairs for their nightly inspection. I looked at him, the man who refused to leave his house, but saw the world more clearly than anyone I'd ever met, and I had to smile. "So," I said, leaning back as Fritz poured the coffee, "does this mean I get to move the white pepper back to where it belongs tomorrow? Or are we keeping the new arrangement just to keep Fritz on his toes?" Wolfe gave me a look that could have withered a cactus. "The pepper, Archie, will be returned to its proper alphabetical station at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Chaos has had its hour in this house. It will not be granted a second." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes reflecting the candlelight, and for a moment he looked almost satisfied. I didn't push it. I just drank my coffee and listened to the quiet, knowing that by tomorrow we'd be waiting for the next doorbell to ring, bringing another piece of the broken world to our doorstep. But tonight, the lamb was perfect, the house was silent, and Nero Wolfe was exactly where he wanted to be.